I was raised to be a Zionist. I was raised to be an Israeli patriot. With the kind of family that I had, it's almost a given. It's a given. I mean, really, you don't learn about Israel and Zionism in a textbook. You eat it, you drink it. It's in your mother's milk. It's on every dinner around the table. Every dinner, that's everything that's discussed. When you have that kind of family, all family gatherings, nobody talks about anything but the state and so forth, and Zionism. And then I believe that as humans, the thing that causes us to change our perspective dramatically, is usually something terrible. There's usually something so horrible that it shakes us to a point where we can no longer accept what we thought was true, and we have to investigate and expand our understanding and our knowledge of the world. And that's what happened to me. I mean, you carry the coffin of a 13-year-old girl to her grave. That's not something you can just forget, and then the next day you go back to work and life is the same. It's never the same.
Yeah.
And so it drove me to, not only myself, but, my sister, her husband, and so on. But it drove me a little bit further, but to get in touch and talk to the other side. I believe that what happens is, because there's so much violence, and really what people hear about when we talk about Palestine, Israel, is violence.
Right.
We don't hear about anything, other than the violence. So we go through this list of occurrences, list of attacks, list of people being killed, lists of tragedies and horrors, that it becomes just, you become completely detached from it. What I like to do is to stop and say, well, look what happened. This was the September the 4th, 1997. 3 young Palestinians took their own lives and the lives of Israelis, civilians, kids, whatever, on that street in downtown Jerusalem. How does that happen?
Yeah.
How could that possibly happen? What kind of reality has to exist for something so terrible? And then, of course, since then there were so many others, and before there were so many others. But if let's just talk about the one, and I researched this and I've written about this and so on. But the bottom line is that the power exists in the hands of Israel. The reality that was created throughout the entire country, which I refer to as Palestine, but some people still call it Israel. The reality in that entire country was changed dramatically since the creation of the state of Israel. And from that moment on, nothing but violence and bloodshed and horror has been taking place, not only there, but in the region as well. So it's probably the most destabilizing factors in the modern history of this region. So Israel created this reality where the oppression, the lack of respect for human life, the lack of respect for people's dignity towards the Palestinian is so severe that something so horrible can take place. Now, mind you, the vast majority of Palestinian resistance to this reality has not been armed resistance, has not been violent resistance. There's been many, many other ways. And this is something that we portray a lot here at Palestine House of Freedom. We talk about that a lot. This entire experience of how Palestinians have expressed their resistance. But sure, armed resistance has always been a part of it. And this particular type, the suicide bombing phenomenon, was very, very short. And so I had to find out, well, I was living in America. So I came back here and I thought, I got to talk to somebody. Now, I was living in Southern California. Nobody wants to talk about the Middle East when you live in sunny San Diego. Everybody's busy, having fun, going to the beach, making money, But finally, at last, I found there was this phenomenon at the time called living room dialogue groups. And you could find them everywhere, but there was one in San Diego that I found. And it was unique because these were all hardcore activists, and it was called Jewish Palestinian Dialogue, which is really it shouldn't be called that, because there's no problem between Jews and Palestinians. It's the Zionists and the Israelis and the Palestinians. But that was how it was framed. And we would meet in each other's homes once a month, and people would just tell their stories. It was not an accusatory. It was not a debate. It was not an argument. It was people telling their stories. And I'm sitting there with these Palestinians, and, I come from a family like mine. I know everything.
Yeah.
I know the truth. I know everything. I mean, look where I come from. Look, this is my whole life. And they're telling me the day is night, night is day. They may as well have been telling me that the earth is flat. Now, some other Israelis and some other Jewish people would listen to the Palestinian story, tell their stories, and leave and say, oh, they're liars, they're anti-Semitic, it's all some kind of conspiracy. I'm sitting looking at these people. I'm going, they can't all be lying. They're telling a very similar story. Something is wrong here. So I began to do my own research. And at that time, this is around 2000, 2001, several Israeli historians had come out with They were called new historians. They rewrote what happened when the state of Israel was established in 1948. And what they revealed was, because they were able to go into the state archives and the army archives, because a lot of documents were opened after 50 years or whatever it was. And they basically validated what Palestinians have been saying all along, which is there was a genocide. There was a campaign of ethnic cleansing that was very well planned. It was a massive force, very well trained and very well armed on the Israeli side. And there were just Palestinian civilians basically on the other side that had no weapons and no support whatsoever. And that's it. You know, between the end of 1947 and the beginning of 1949, so a little over a year, Palestine was wiped out, gone.
Wow.
Almost 1 million Palestinians exiled. God knows how many were killed. And that's it. The country changed its name to Israel.
And so here's one of the things that I'd love to clear up. You know, who enabled that? Was it the British? Was it Harry S. Truman, who was the president of the United States? I have a great clip that I found from 1948, and I might insert it here, where President Truman literally talks about having to divide Palestine. He talks about, you know, I had to make the Jews happy. I had to make the Arabs happy. It's not easy to move out millions of people and move in millions of people.
That decision to recognize Israel was an easy one. I had to make a compromise with the Arabs and divide Palestine. The Jews wanted to chase all the Arabs into the Tigris and Euphrates River, and the Arabs wanted to chase all the Jews into the Red Sea. And what I was trying to do was to find a homeland for the Jews and still be just with the Arabs. But when you go into a thing of that kind, the people you help most are the ones that get most angry with you. Both of them were against me on the situation, but as President of the United States, I paid no attention to them, carried out what I thought was right, and I had the support of the Congress, and I could do it, which is unusual in these days.
Could you tell us specifically that a lot of Jewish people were against you, too?
Oh, well, there were a lot of Jewish people against me because they wanted the whole of Palestine. As I say, they wanted to drive all the Arabs into the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. We had several other people in the country, even among the Jews, the Zionists particularly, who were against anything that was to be done if they couldn't have the whole of Palestine and everything handed to them on a silver plate so they wouldn't have to do anything. It couldn't be done. We had to take it in small doses. You can't move 5 or 6 million people out of a country and fill it up with 5 or 6 million more and expect both sets of them to be pleased.
You know, people don't understand this is how it happened. And so this is why Palestinian people are so pissed off, because in 1948, they literally got moved out. Were the British behind it? Were the Americans behind it? Was it a combination?
So before I answer that question, I just want to say a little episode. One of the rabbis that was here just now speaking, he was talking about the fact. So there's always been a Jewish community in Palestine, and they saw themselves as Palestinian Jews. The Zionists were Jews that came from Europe, that came from outside. Kind of the old Jewish population in Palestine lived very well, and they had good relations with the Palestinians. You know, they were the minority. The Muslims were the majority. Then the next minority were Christians, and the Jews were, you know, a little bit less. But everybody got along, and they would babysit each other's children, and they would work together and so forth. And the Jews never expected or demanded sovereignty. They were quite happy to live as citizens of whoever the government was. And Jewish law also prescribes that that's what you need to do. As a Jew, you need to be a good citizen, you need to be loyal to your country, that sort of thing. Because Jews are a religious minority that lives everywhere. The Zionists came, they were secular, they were not from Palestine, they came from outside. They were supported by the British, and they suddenly brought death and destruction and conflict and hate and bloodshed to Palestine. So it's not the indigenous Jewish community of Palestine that was responsible for this. It was people from the outside, settlers, colonizers that came.
Got it.
So it was the British, and then they supported the Zionist idea. Now, just to give it a little more background, the Zionist movement began really to grow at the beginning of the 20th century. I mean, it started at the end of the 19th, but really the beginning of the 20th century, it began to grow. And there was a whole cadre of leaders, young, educated, smart, well-spoken. My grandfather was one of them, who traveled around the world to speak to the leaders around the world and to convince them to support the idea of a Jewish state in Palestine. Basically, that's what Zionism is.
Yeah.
I actually have a poster of my grandfather speaking somewhere in around the world. And because they didn't look Jewish, these people were all had shaved their beards. They were secular. They spoke several languages. They were highly educated. They're very impressive people. The powers that be at the time, in the US too, but mostly then in Europe, were impressed. They said, yes, why not? This is a good idea. Let's colonize. Let's send the Jews over to this other place. We solve all the problems. We get rid of the Jews, and we can collaborate with this secular Western Jewish colony that we create for ourselves as an ally, in the heart of the Arab world, in the heart of the Middle East. And they did a very good job. The Zionists did a very good job. And that's why to this day, more than 100 years later, they have a great deal of influence in politics, in the media, in popular culture, in education. They take a good look. There's all these Zionist organizations around every state checking, social studies textbooks, making sure the language is right and so on. And they've done this. They've done a very, very good job. So then they created a reality in which here in America, in the UK, and, in the West, basically, people grow up with a Zionist education. So they know about Israel. They know about the Bible stories. They know about the Holocaust. Ask them about Palestine, they confuse it with Pakistan.
That's interesting.
There's no Palestine in it in textbooks. There's no Palestine in the history books. My kids in high school took, AP World History. It's basically a book this big about everything from when the world began till today, right?
Yeah.
They study it in high school. There's no Palestine, maybe as an ancient name or something like that. But there's all this stuff about Israel. So that's the result of all this really incredible work by the Zionists, that they were able to get this influence. There was no counter to that. There's never been a counter to that.
Can you really quick define, that another piece of confusion is Zionism. Can you define Zionism and then differentiate it from Judaism? Because I think that right now is what America is waking up to. The world gets it a little bit better, but I think America is waking up to, wait a minute, there's Zionists and then there's Judaism. Can you help us understand that?
Sure. So Zionism is an ideology that basically says the Jewish people have a right from all over the world, have a right to go to Palestine and take over and create their own state and support that idea. That's in a sentence, that's what Zionism is.
Okay. And what gives them that right? Is this the hey, 3,000 years ago we were promised this land? What gives them that right?
So this is what's interesting. The Zionists, especially the early Zionists, were all secular.
Okay.
They left Judaism, they left religion, but they felt they wanted their own place. But on this issue, they go back to the Old Testament and they say, God promised us the land. So what they did is they secularized Judaism.
Yeah.
Is really blasphemous. I remember talking to this rabbi about this and he started laughing. They said the Jewish people are the descendants of the ancient Hebrews from thousands of years ago, which is not really true. Then they said the Bible is not a book of faith, it's a history book, which is of course nonsense. And then they said our homeland as Jews is Palestine, which by the way, 1,000,000 years ago may have been called Judea or Israel or something like that for a very short time in its history, right? Going back as 4,000 years, it's been called Palestine, but never mind that. So they put these three things together. So Jews are not anymore a religious minority that has multiple nationalities, because you could be an Arab Jew, an African Jew, a European Jew, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. You have nothing in common with one another except your faith. So I said, no, we're all one nation, just like in the modern sense of the word. Then they said the Bible is our history book, the Old Testament. It's not a book of faith. Forget all the God and all that nonsense. It's a book of history, and Palestine is our homeland, and we have a right to go back. Now, Protestant Europe and Protestant America loved that. It spoke to their own sense of how the world should be.
Okay.
Really, that's the beginning of Zionism. Zionism began with the Protestant world before it even became a Jewish thing. So then, so that's what the Zionists did. They created this new thing, which didn't exist. Now, Jews at the time, originally, had come out very strongly against Zionism. In the year 1900, all the rabbis, all the important rabbis around the world published a booklet in Hebrew for the Jewish people, warning them of the dangers of this idea of a Jewish state. And what they said was, simply put, a Jewish state will create discord, will bring about discord between the Jews and Arabs and Jews and Muslims who had very good relations. It will bring bloodshed and violence to the Holy Land, and it will cast doubt as to the loyalty of Jews in the countries in which they live, because Jews live around all these different countries and they're citizens of all these different countries. Now, suddenly, people will start doubting their loyalty. Are they loyal to this or that? Now, all these three things these warnings came out in the year 1900. They all came true. That's exactly what happened. Violence, discord between Jews and Arabs and Jews and Muslims, which historically never existed. They're always good relations because they're sister faiths. And people cast doubt as to the loyalty of Jews and where they stand. So Jews came out against this idea of Zionism very, very early on. And the Jewish community in Palestine in particular, when the state was established, when the UN ratified this idea of a Jewish state in Palestine, they wrote to the United Nations saying, we want no part of this. We don't want to be citizens of the state. These are not our people. They came from outside. They're secular. They've got all these ideas, and it's only going to harm us. So that's the difference. Judaism is a religion, and Jews lived as a religious minority around the world, and that's that. Zionism is this very particular, very racist, very supremacist ideology that says that all Jews around the world have a right to go to Palestine and take the land and make it their own.
Want the full truth? Watch the full Deep Shallow Dive interview next. And hit subscribe if you're done with narratives and ready to call a spade a spade.